Our next speaker, Similani Makoka, alias Kokkie. Now I asked him, where does the Kokkie come from? He says, ek donde. So ek my sê, regte man, dis hoekom hy is waar hy is. Hy's 'n kleinskaalse boer wat op pad is om 'n kommersiële boer te word. And he's really got an incredible story, and he's coming to share his story with us. He's taking his journey from a small-scale farmer, and he's on his way to a commercial farmer. Simon, please come up and come and join. Come and tell us your story. Everybody's very interested in your story.
Thank you very much, Program Director. My story is a short story. And it's a good story too. Thank you very much, everybody who's here. I just want to share you my journey from the small-scale farmer, and today I call myself a certified commercial farmer under this program, NOTIP. I'm not apologetic about it. I've earned it. I've worked hard. And the issue of all about what we're talking about today is just a mindset shift. If you can shift from the old systems, I mean, if you can ask yourself a question, what are you giving back into the very same soil that you are taking much produce and money from it? You give it nothing. But if we can turn back and change our behaviors and go the conservation way, I think we can attain somewhere and we can go somewhere. It is easy. The whole week we have been talking about conservation agriculture, and it's all about food security and sustenance. I'm going to give you my case scenario in Gauteng. I come from Van der Bijl Park and on the farm Zeekoefontein. When I started to think and talk about conservation agriculture, it's almost in 2006 when I came to Gauteng from Northwest. I started wondering after having some talks on a newspaper about conservation agriculture in Argentina. And also Richard, he has encouraged me whilst he was still far from me. The immediate person after reading such an article way back in 2006, I phoned Dr. Hendrik Smith. I think you are around here. Hendrik, I called him in 2006 and said, "Bud, this conservation agriculture, what is it all about?" He was by then still in Pretoria at Soil and Climate Department, Landbouw Department. I drove down to Pretoria and sat with him, and then he convinced me and I invited him to Vereniging met 'n studiegroep. Ek het 'n studiegroep van opkomende boere. So I think this thing moved deep into me. Because so far, I'm the only farmer who proceeded with conservation agriculture. And later, I think I also made an impact around my farmer, my real commercial grootboere, because they were having like 16 tractors, soveel tractors, soveel diesel and all that. But I had only 2 tractors, 190 Fiat tractors. So they carried me through, and they've learned something from me, and they changed their mind. They've bought new planters, they fleet van trackers, hulle is nou 4 groot trackers. And the first time when I came here, 4 years ago, I immediately changed and bought a planter van hierso af. So that planter is the planter that I'm using. I bought it from one commercial farmer. He was also upgrading. He was taking a John Deere fleet of planters. So he was using the case planter. So I get my truck so gestuurd, then he took it back to Van der Bijl Park. So that's the planter that I'm using at this point in time. It's still serving me well, and it's still doing miracles for me. I'm happy about it. If God allows in future, I'll upgrade and then excel for into steward. So far, my machinery, it's good for me. I've got everything that I need. I just want to show you that most of our small-scale farmers, they get pleased if they see the soil being red. You can see that maneki had the haraka planter. Again, the haraka planter gekoop for my groente, and it werkt baie mooi. It works excellently well. But on the other side, it's a recent state of affair on my land. I've just finished harvesting yesterday as I was coming down here. So this is the position of my land so far. All what we need to do is to allow our land to have a cover. That's a story that I've learned. And by covering our land, you protect the whole moisture levels of your land, and also you're building up the humus. The most important thing in our conservation agriculture is humus. That layer, that spongy layer, which holds water and minerals. So it's very important that we don't overgraze our land. I understand from the point of view of a small farmer, we don't have grazing pieces of land so much, but immediately after harvest, do it minimally and actually try to avoid it. You cannot be a farmer without having pasture on the other side. Pasture management and cropping on the other side, those things work hand in hand and they go together. So let's avoid our animals to move in and compact the soil as much as possible. You can see from that slide, there's that old man comes from Botswana. He's my uncle anyway. I have planted on those lands that are very down with production, the degraded lands. I had to put in Brazilian grass, the brass seed. So it was doing well by that time, that during his visit, and he was surprised and can see what's in it no of the land. And also the very important thing is your crop rotation. I'm using mostly the cowpeas as a cover crop, and it works for me because that's cost work baby, but I cowpeas. I'm selling them. I let my animals go into that. And farmers, the most important name nowadays is what we call integrated crop and pasture-based livestock production system. It's a long word, but it explains everything that you need to do. It's very important that we integrate our crops and then also pasture. You cannot be a farmer without having some pastures for your livestock. It shows, on this slide, it shows the reality of my land during the summer crop, the summertime. That crop, that was my crop by that time. You need to have grass for your own and for the soil production. And also livestock, which diversify and improves the soil situation, and also your cash flow. We cannot go continually, you cannot wait for 6 months to get some of the income. So keep livestock, plant pastures, and then life gets better. When your crop is ready, harvest. I know there's a lot of challenge with small-scale farmers, but we have overcome that from my farm perspective. Issues of harvesting, it's very important, because if you don't have the right implement to harvest your crop, it's going to be lost on the whole land, in your whole land. So your harvesters must be ready, your delivery trucks must be ready, and at the silos for the storage also, it must be ready. It was a pity this year, farmers, we had a bumper crop to an extent that we had to wait for a whole week before you can go deliver your next crop. You would obito yes, altitude. So I did my best. I had to hire a silo from my neighbor who was not utilizing it. And then I've got my 400 tons deposited in that, whereas the rest of my maize is in the silos. So it's very important to plan ahead. In case like this year where we had a bumper crop, Maron Satnichel, that's the thing. We don't have money, the price of maize has just collapsed like nobody's business. And I don't think farmers are now interested in farming, in doing the maize production. So that's the planter. It's a basic planter, a no-till planter that was bought here in Bergville and been transported to Gauteng and is doing miracles. And I'm happy about it. And basically what we need, that fleet of ploeg and all that, we need to discard them and put them aside. All what you need is a good tractor that can pull and has got the capacity to pull the planter itself. And then you need a boom spray for your wheat eradication and control. And then a minimum rainfall. It's a pity, I can hear from people from Stellenbosch, they say that men reën gekry daar. But if you can have at least minimum of 400 millimeters, it's okay. And a wrapper is very important. I mean, we're using heavy machines, we're treating the land and all that, and we're starting to compact the soil. Once in 3 years, roer, your grond. It's very important. And first things first. I believe in first things first. You know, when I started, I did not doubt myself. When I started conservation agriculture, I just made up my mind and said, this is the right thing to do. So, I never look aside. I'm now doing 300 hectares of land, fully conservational. I did not look around. And I've seen some of our extension officers from the department. They go do trials on a half a hectare, on a small scale, on a hectare. You cannot get good results on that. It really does, it will not give you the whole issue and the whole results. So please, as you are experimenting this with our upcoming farmers, maak daai lande bietjie groter. Skefele, so that you can get the whole history and the whole experience of what you are doing. So, like what I did, if I believe in a concept or in a thing, I do it, I go full time. If it swallows me, hard luck. If I win, it's a win situation, I go forward. That's who I am, and that's how we should approach the whole thing. And farmers, as you are going back into your farm, especially small developing farmers, check your soil structure. It's very important. The water retention, it's also very important. You must understand and know the land or this land that you are doing with. Your pH status, very important. Analysis of nutrition in your land, also very, very much important. And fertilizer. Although we want to reduce, at the ultimate end, the aim is to use minimal fertilization, minimal pesticides. But from the beginning, this is what you need to do. You can't do otherwise. Your production practices must be, you've got normal practices, like crop rotation, which is very important. Your cover crops. Cover crops, cover crops, cover crops, that's the name of the day. If you don't do that, know that you are just doing something else. Your plant residues, you must leave them on top of your land. If you can make it minimally, just for the sake of the wind, because if you leave crop residues right open on the land, there will be another factor, which is the wind, will blow them away. But that is not a problem. We can live with that. The position of your land, the contours, check those things. If you start, you want to be a successful farmer. And above all, the certified seed. Moenie net agtergaan en okrea enige sat and then no. Get certified seeds so that you can get the results. So that tomorrow, if there's a problem, you can have a recourse and go back to whichever, to Monsanto or Panaro or Dicap, and say, guys, this is your seed. It doesn't perform, it didn't perform. Let's retest it. There's specs behind the seed or on the tag. Read it, understand it. Hold them accountable for anything that might go wrong on your land. And the best thing, use your integrated pest control. Don't use one chemical day on, day out. Because our seed, our pests also, they get used to those chemicals. So let's use them, but if we practice conservation agriculture, we ultimately going to go down, 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 and next, those pesticides and that thing. And this is just a tip for you small farmers mostly, that check your planter. Don't sit and stoop in. No. When it's planting time, go there, be there, get soiled. Check as the planter is going on. Hand and trail. Check everything. The ketang elkede for adiatama. Because your worker will always say, that loop rech. And unfortunately, the planters that you are using are the old planters. You need to have monitors on your planter. You cannot afford the whole day going up and down planting. And then at the end of the day, after 7 days, that's next what opcom. Let's improve, let's shift with time. You must have a GPS or a monitor on your planter. It shows how many seeds. You actually determine your yield before even planting. You just tell yourself, you calibrate that planter for you. It's so fuel, so many population per hectare, and then that begin plant. Then you can tell a person, say, I have planted. You can say, ek hoop ek het geplant. God sal vir my help. Nee, dit werk nie so nie. So this is all the good tips that you needed to do. Successful yield farmers depend entirely on your management and your control ability or capability. The other thing is your soil potential. I'm getting into one space. I'm trying to prove this thing and say, fine, it's soil capacity and it's soil potential. We are moving. I want to shift. I know it's scientifically you can't do it, but with CA, we are going to try to shift the soil potential. Let's feed this soil of yours with humus or with all these covering crops. I suspect 2 years from there, you'll see the soil potential will increase. Your soil potential will increase. In most cases, yes, you cannot get more than your soil potential. Your soil will say, I can not do so fair, hard. But we need to push it further, just a little bit. Boost it, and then take care of it. Then you can shift the poles of your soil potential. And I know planters and machineries and all this process is very expensive to change, to take over, to go into our conservation agriculture. It's expensive, but we are doing our best. We have lobbied government. We have drafted a policy. We cannot sit like this without a policy that governs what we're trying to do, the conservation agriculture. There is a need for a policy. And so far we have pushed it. I was one of the delegates that were doing and drafting that policy. The policy is now sitting with the executive EXCO, and it should be signed. And then that's where we can lobby government, we can lobby other service providers. The price of machinery is very expensive. Your government must help you, must subsidize those planters so that we can go in. We cannot have a government that has its mouth sealed. It must talk about this thing. And also ourselves, the commodity groups, the grain SA, all leaders, we must go and actually make recommendation that this is the only way to go. They must fast track element because spoedig wees om daai te teken, om daai policy to sign in that policy, so that we can now lobby even the insurances. I mean, the premium, the insurance premium must go a little bit downwards, because we as the practitioners of soil conservation, we put the soil in the right position to produce the right crops. Therefore, their risk, it's limited. The insurance risks, it's also going down. So we need to have that benefit, that we need to pay a lower premium if you are doing or utilizing conservation agriculture. And this is very important. I'm leaving you, everybody, with let's change. Conservation agriculture is the way to go, and that's the way to go. There's no other way around. That's the way to do things correctly. And thank you very much. I'll wait for questions.
Shimi, we want to get more of you. Yeah, with this positive attitude, the drive that you've shown us. And let's remember that it's the individual, combination of all individuals' energies that produce results, not us just sitting on chairs asking the government to do it. It's up to us to make it happen. And Shimi, we really appreciate the time that you've given us, and we pray and we hope that your mother will be fine soon.
Thanks, it's nice to see positive people. Erna Creer has also been working in the small-scale division of agriculture. She's been doing this for 20 years, and she's coming to show us what she's reached in her 20 years. Erna, baie dankie dat jy gekom het en vir ons te kom wys dat kleinskaalse mense ook kan groot verskille maak in ons samelewing. Baie dankie.
I want to start by just expressing my gratitude to my team to start with, because most of what I'm going to present today is their hard work and their commitment to this process, and also to Dr. Smith from Grain SA for his unwavering support, and then the support from the Maize Trust to do this work. So this program is a learning and research process that we're doing with smallholder farmers. And it's basically a way of saying, how do we help promote the use of or working with conservation agriculture in the smallholder sector? So it's optimizing the process for non-commercial and semi-commercial smallholders. We started there because most of the people that live in rural areas are at that level. They produce food for their homesteads, and they want to eat first before they think about selling things. So over the 3 or 4 years that we've been involved, these are the study areas or the areas where we are working. So in Bergville, we're working in about 17 villages in the Eastern Cape and Southern KZN. It's more of a mishmash of areas, so 4 villages around Matatiele, a couple around Iklopo, and then Crichton and Umzimkhulu. And then we started also in the Midlands. Again, it depends on interest from people. People get to hear about the process. They come and see on the Farmers' Days what's happening. And so we get invited into areas. So it's kind of word of mouth, the way we're spreading the process. I wanted to give people a rough idea of the kind of beneficiaries we're working with. The people who are doing this farming, maybe their constraints under which they work. Most of our farmers are female, because they're the ones that are responsible for food production and keeping food on the table every day. What we found in our 4 years of doing this work is that we're now getting more male participants involved because they've been looking and watching and seeing, okay, this is working. So they get more involved. Our average household size is around five household members. And then usually when you're starting with agriculture, the age group of people is quite high. So they retired people. The older people who still feel like farming is in their blood. And we're also noticing that over time the ages of our participants are starting to decrease somewhat. So we're now sitting sort of in the 36 to 55 years of age as our average. We started around 65 as our average. Basically, most of them, their primary income source is social grants. So they live off grants. Many of them have no other income source. They have to live entirely off the grants that they receive from government, and those are child grants and pensions and disability grants. Some are employed, it's about 11% of the participants, and slowly but surely farming is coming in as a way that people are making money. And this is the farming that we're doing with them. So the overall incomes are extremely low, so it's around 2,000 Rand a month for the whole family, not per person. And that's the combination of the few grants that they can get together. So what we're finding also as we go along, so our average income, say for this year, we check it every year just to see who the participants are and where it's settling. So it's actually even lower than it was last year. And that kind of shows that some of the poorer people are also starting to join the program. Because at some stage, people are too poor even to do this. So for us, that's not necessarily a bad sign. Okay, the maize and beans that people produce through the trials and through the work we're doing with CA is mostly for household food supply, and so we also check how much food can they produce for themselves during this time. And we're now sitting at a point where about 53% of the participants are producing enough food for the year. So it's gone up, and it's slowly going up. The model that we're using is a farmer innovation development, so it's a big word, but it's basically saying that we work in partnership. So with other NGOs, with government departments, with municipalities, and then with the communities. And the way we do that is through learning groups. So it's similar to the study groups maybe that people might know about. Or we work with village savings and loan associations, so people can have some cash to buy their inputs and do the work. And also organized farmers associations and cooperatives. So it just depends on who's there and how they're interested in doing the work. And we specifically work within the whole value chain, so it's not just focusing on the production. So it's helping people with the whole system of how they get their inputs, maybe setting up bulk buying groups, how the production works and all the technicalities of introducing CA and learning with CA to become better at it, storage and marketing. In terms of the awareness raising and implementation, we're using a horizontal scaling model, we're calling it that, which is really we start in one village with one group of people and it spreads from there. In these areas, awareness creation cannot really be done through media as such. It's one of those places where people doing things is your best advertisement. And so this process has worked quite well for us. So we started in 2013 just with 3 villages and 50 participants, and then every year it's slowly been climbing and we're involved in more and more. As more and more people become involved, then they take on some of the roles of doing the work within the community. So we have farmer volunteers who help others. We have local facilitators who manage the groups and manage the interactions between the stakeholders. And then when people are ready, we start working with them so that they set up farmer centers. So those are local input supply centers where they can also give advice, because people come all the time and say, how do you do this? But you do need to be shown. It's not just something that you can be told. I've got some photographs in each one of these slides that maybe don't relate directly to what I'm talking about, but I wanted to give people a feel of what it looks like and what people are doing. So in these photographs, the top one, Mr. Madondo there, is one of our local facilitators and a field worker. He's busy working with a group of ladies to get ready for planting, and they're there with one of our hand planters. It's called an MBLI, or we call it Mbili planter. And in the bottom one is Pumelele Hlongwane, and she's standing in her trial of Dolichos, which she interplanted with maize. Okay, and then the awareness raising part of it is that we have farmers' days, we have open days, people go and check out in the fields what's happening, and they ask questions, and they get shown how it works. And then we have big events once a year where we bring everybody and anybody who's interested to come and see. We do presentations, and then also the farmer experimentation is the central part of the process. So each person that is involved runs their own experiment. Rather than having trials that are managed by outsiders, they do them themselves. And then the learning group or interested people are built around that. So not everybody that's involved actually does the trials. Some of them decide initially, okay, we're going to just watch how this works and see whether we want to become involved. So that builds up over time. We have learning workshops with people. We have sessions in the field where we go and see what's happening. Are there issues? Are there bugs? Are there diseases? What do we need to do next? And then also these learning groups can discuss together how they can do the marketing and the storage. So we do promote that people try and work together because the scale at which they work is really small. You know, most of these people have about half a hectare that they have access to, not much more than that. Okay, so the farmer experimentation, we try and build on it incrementally so that the learning process can continue over time and that people have the right building blocks on which they can start making decisions for themselves. So it's a process of trying to create informed decision making through observation, learning, and then the decision making. So the first year, we predefine the choices. We set out the trials for people. We suggest to them that they do intercropping, which people are initially quite reluctant to do. It's not something they're presently used to anymore. And so we have a process where we start with the intercropping. It's a close spacing trial planting, similar to the Brazilian system, of tram lines, 2 rows legumes, 2 rows maize. And we use both cowpeas and beans. So in the first year, what they're experimenting with is the planters. So they're comparing the handheld planters, the animal-drawn planters with the hand hoes that they normally use. By the second year, they start to include different things. So then we start looking at different maize varieties and how they do. So we compare them. Different types and varieties of legumes, we might suggest, or people might suggest. So that's the thing, is that they also say, look, we want to try this, and then we make a few suggestions and we come up with the trial designs from that. So early planting, it's always an issue in these rural areas that planting is quite late, because you've got to wait for the rains and you've got to wait for the cattle to be taken back into the pastures. So there's a few people that can take on the early planting. They can keep the cattle out of their fields. Manure and fertilizer combinations, if you have livestock, you can use manure. So there are farmers who want to do that. And then targeted fertility regimes is around those people that have, we do the soil samples for everyone. But a lot of people just ask us to suggest to them what fertilizers to use and how much of it. Some people would like to use their own targeted and pest control measures. So then by the third year, people have got the hang of this, they understand how it's working, they've seen how the CA works and what they like about it and not. So by then they start making a lot more of their own decisions. We still then introduce the intercropping and crop rotation options, and then the cover crops become a lot more important there. So summer, both systems for putting in summer and winter cover crops. Mulching has become something that is on the agenda, even though at field level it's quite a mission, but getting soil cover into the system is a challenge. So in some places people have actually even agreed to do the mulching. So organic options, there are people who say, look, we really don't want to or can't afford the inputs, so we want to try and do it organically. Different herbicides, because it depends on the year, on how well people have learned to do the spraying. In these dry years, sometimes the herbicides are not as effective as they normally are, and then people realize, okay, herbicides are not the panacea, and there's actually management that goes with that. Still different planting times. Now we're starting to look at sort of late planting of beans and seeing how that works. The pictures here at the top is a relay crop of a winter cover crop mix planted into maize. So that is sire oats, fodder rye, and I can't remember whether that was the vetch or the radish, but one or the other. And at the bottom is a typical intercrop plot, what it looks like late season. You'll see from here maybe, and it is an ongoing issue, is that germination is not perfect with the hand planters, and especially when it's dry and you're planting a little bit too shallowly. Okay, we work with all three principles. We work with people throughout the season. So with a minimum soil disturbance, just wanted to give you an idea of some of the tech, the appropriate tech that we are playing with. So here's an animal-drawn planter being used here in January to plant in a late planting of summer cover crops. That photograph there, it's like a, we haven't come up with a name for it, but it's a push weeder. It has a blade behind the wheel there that you push, it just cuts the weeds at ground level. Because we're finding that sometimes weeding with a hoe is quite, you spend so much time not disturbing the soil while planting, and then you come in with a hoe and you sort of scuffle everything up. So we were trying to minimize the soil disturbance through the weeding practices. This is a Matroka planter. It's sort of a well-known handheld planter, but we found that they're definitely not robust enough for these high clay soils in Burkeville. So they work better in the sandy soils, but around here we're not using them anymore. There's the Mbili planter. It has a little bag on the back and a pipe coming down the side. And you put the seed in the one and the fertilizer in the other, and then they come out in one of the two teeth. So you can do your fertilizer and seed together. And that saves quite a lot of time when you're doing hand planting. Okay, so in terms of soil cover, here on the left, we're getting people to learn about soil cover. Why is it important? What does it mean? How do you decide how much soil cover you have? So here, Sylvester is busy showing people using a square. So you kind of guesstimate it and average it out. Because we played with how people are estimating their soil cover, and every person had a different answer. So we had to come up with a system of how to work it. These two photographs here are a trial plot. One on the left here is a 3-year CA plot, so there's already a little bit of cover there. This is a conventionally plowed plot, and that's kind of the difference that you can see in the soil. We had some runoff plots that we put on those, and from one rainfall event in December, I'm not sure whether it's clear, but there's a little bit of water in the bottom of the bucket there. It's got some organic matter floating on the top, but it's completely clear, and we collected about 42 mils of runoff there, and for the same rainfall event on that field, we collected 195 mil, and very muddy water. So that kind of shows us, because part of what we want to see is whether we can adapt the CA system to the smallholder environment so that the principles are still intact and being respected, and that the benefit from using the CA is still there. So even with not as much soil cover as we would like, you can see that the runoff and infiltration, I think I've got some infiltration results later, that is actually already improving quite substantially. And so for us, that's a win, and we continue with those processes. The third one is the diversity, and that we introduce through the intercropping, for example, and the summer cover crops. Here's an example, January kind of planting, I think, of an intercrop with Dolichos and Pan 6079. We use these older hybrids primarily because people prefer them. So when we do the trials, basically we do a pre-spray with a post-emergent and or contact herbicides, depending. We've tried to move away from Roundup because of the issues with Roundup. And because we're doing intercropping, we were suspecting that some of the germination issues with the beans had to do with that. In cases where we have a lot of grasses, we also use some of the pre-emergent herbicides. But that's the last time we spray. After that, we rely on the design of the trial to deal with a lot of the weeding issues. So because of the close spacing, generally if you get rain at the time, then you should get crop canopy cover within 4 to 5 weeks. So after that, you don't have to weed again. So it means that people only need to weed once, which is a great relief for them. And sometimes not at all, depending on whether they start to actually manage the weed incidence in their fields. When we start this, usually weed covers about 90%. People just the weed buildup is quite incredible. So that's the plan. And it works sometimes. If it doesn't rain, it doesn't work. If your germination isn't very good, it doesn't work. So there are cases where people have to weed 3 or 4 times during the season. Some of them would like to try and use herbicides, and then we will speak to them specifically about what they can do. But obviously, if you're intercropping with the beans, your options are a lot more limited. And that's partly why we then introduced the crop rotation. So here's an example of a 2nd or 3rd year trial, where people are starting to compare different maize varieties. So here they were comparing PAN 53 with 4679, and then also different bean varieties. So this is, for example, a Pannar variety, which is determinate, and it yields once. And this was a Kulinga, which is a semi-determinate variety. So this one had a bit more rust on it, but it had a lot more volume, and the yields, in fact, were similar. People, however, preferred the more determinate variety, because for them it's quite hard to go in and harvest over a period of time. They like to be able to go in once and just harvest once. So that way we get to show people, and they get to make their decisions about their varieties. So the cover crop mixes, we generally don't just work with one cover crop at a time. We promote mixes for people. And those are brought in when we do the crop rotation, so then we can plant block plantings of the cover crops with the other monocrop blocks. So people like the crop rotation because they find that the intercropping, especially with the close spacing, it's quite difficult to get in there and do the weeding. Somehow people don't like the cowpea so very much. We keep on reintroducing them and people keep on taking them off the agenda. But I'm a lover of cowpeas, so I'm afraid we're going to have to live with those for another while. So the cover crops are great for soil health, and you can actually see it. It makes a visual difference in the soil within the 1st or 2nd year. So once people see that, once they see that their maize starts growing a lot better after that, then they become sold on the cover crops. We're battling to create a system where people can keep seed. Okay, I'm not going to go through the numbers in too much detail, but wanted to just show that over time, the numbers of people that are these are the numbers of people that are actually doing trials. So we've got more than 200 trials here in Bergville now, trial sites. Those are all monitored. The field workers, I don't know how they do it, but they manage to go and see everybody. A couple of times a season, they do the monitoring, planting, growth, and harvesting monitoring and yield monitoring. So we get yields for all those people. We sit with them, we redesign their trials for the next year. So it's very labor intensive, but it's also a very good way of learning how to do this. And we can now start seeing farmers taking this on by themselves, so we feel justified in putting in all that effort. The average maize yield, these are on the trials, has slowly but surely been creeping up. So we started with the trial yields of about 3.74. It was a really good year, 2013-14. And even through the drought year last year, the yields were, for those that did get yields, we had a situation where people either got nice yields or nothing at all. So it still went up there. I put the brackets, the 3.09, because if we add all 210, 12 trials there, that's the average. It's higher in the people that have been around for a longer period of time, because every year new participants come in. So we keep track of the older participants and the new participants to see what the differences are in terms of how they're doing. In the Eastern Cape, our results are not nearly as interesting. We're really battling to get traction in some of those low organic matter sandy soils. And it seems that the whole social, political situation in the Eastern Cape also works against people putting in effort. We often find that people are quite keen until they realize, oh, I've got to do it. And you go, yeah. Because there have been too many programs there where government rushes in and does stuff for people, and especially ploughing, and it is still going on. So now they believe that should be done for them. So it's much harder to find people there who are willing to put in the time. The other thing that we've noticed is that the maximum yields have been creeping up, but you can see the variability in yields is extremely high. And for us, in terms of trying to do some research and see what the trends are, that's making it complicated. We also look at how much food people are making. We decide on something that we call a rand replacement value, because a lot of people keep that maize and millet as their own maize meal. So we want to see how much money they're saving at least, even if they're not making money. So what their sort of saving potential is in terms of the amount of maize they produce. This is just from the trial, so obviously also doing their controls and their normal planting alongside. Then with the beans, the yields are lowish and they're staying lowish. Every year we seem to come up with a new challenge for why the beans didn't work well this time, but we are determined. So we'll keep on trying. We take soil samples for people when they start, and then after about 2 or 3 years, we'll go back and resample their plots and see whether there's any difference. So what we've noticed is that for the CA plots, that their average pH has increased, their average acid saturation has decreased a bit, they need less P, they need less lime, and then the percentage organic matter is marginally higher, and the average percentage N is about the same. So for us, this means that using the CA practice actually means that you have a reduced need for fertilizer application over time. Of course, we would have liked to see a larger increase in the organic C, but because the ground cover is removed through grazing a lot of the time, that is going to happen a lot more slowly. But it is happening. We've also been doing the soil health tests for a selection of the participants. It's a bit expensive to do it for everybody. And again, we try and compare across years. What we found here is that in some ways it's easier to compare these results within a year across different types of experiments than across the years. Because the 2 years that we chose was a bumper year and then a very dry year. And so the first thing that you see is that if you look at the green bars and the orange bars, those are comparable across the 2 years. That for the first year, all the results were much higher than for the second year. So that has to do with the weather, not actually with people's farming practices. So it became hard for us to distinguish what was weather-related and what was farming practices. But what we did see is that these Solvita tests, those are the ones that test the microbial activity in the soil. And then the soil health score is a combination of that with the water extractable nitrogen, carbon-nitrogen ratios, are much higher for the CA trial plots than the control plots for both seasons, even though the second season was lower than the first. So that also means for us that we're on the right track, and that the soil health is increasing through using the CA. And that is a very important thing for us, because a lot of the times the soils that these smallholders work with are not the best soils to start with. And then they generally are quite tired by the time we arrive, because people might be using them year after year and mining them, really, because sometimes they don't use fertilizer. If they can't afford it, they just don't put anything in. And we're slowly working with people for them to learn that's a very dangerous practice and self-defeating in a lot of ways. The other thing that we work with people is around costs and what they buy and what they don't buy and how they make decisions about inputs. Because they're poor, because they don't have a lot of money, because it's very hard for poor people to save, they often don't have cash come planting season. And they're definitely not going to have enough cash to plant a hectare. So if you think back about what we were saying about their average income per month is about 2,000 rand. If you think they now have to try and save 8, 9, 10,000 rand to plant a hectare of maize, it's an impossibility for them. So we're working on systems starting with smaller plots, trying to make it as cheap as possible, and for people to be aware about what they're spending money on, so what they'll do is they'll buy the seed, but maybe not the fertilizer, because they think they don't have enough money. But maybe it would be a better idea to buy less seed and some fertilizer, or something like that, so that you change the combinations of things and the habits that people have to try and increase the production and the efficiency of that. So this is no longer the average maize price, because it's gone down quite substantially, but it was that earlier in the year. So what we're finding with participants in this non-commercial system, that for them to be able to break even to pay back what they've spent on their production, They have to have a yield of about 3.94 tons a hectare. But the average yields, especially for the conventional way of planting in these areas, is much lower. Presently, our average yields for the CA is sitting somewhere between 1.4 and 4.2, so we're just kind of making it. Sugar beans, when they get yields, generally they make a good income from that. Okay, so then we work with these figures, and then we start looking at, okay, so what is your biggest cost? So it is still fertilizer. So in a lot of ways, we're saying to people, yes, fertilizer is nice. Yes, you get an immediate result from it. Yes, it's increased your yields quite a lot. But we also want to work with a system where we use as little fertilizer as possible and still get the yields. So not a no input, no output system, but a low input, high output system. So the next cost is seed. And this is where you then realize that why people still try and keep seed. So in all these systems, people still keep their own maize seed. They call it traditional seed, but these days it's a mixture of anything and everything, because each person plants their own thing. So some people are planting OPVs, some are planting hybrids, and then some are planting GM. And that all gets mixed into one big pot and becomes what they're now calling traditional seed. So the traditional seed is actually, the yields are even lower than they used to be. It's very variable now. Anyway, people still do it, regardless. So then we look at, okay, so here are the prices, which is why we went back to suggesting, okay, let's look at some of the OPVs and compare them with the traditional varieties that you're using and see whether, because that already produces a large difference in yield, even though the OPVs are obviously not as high performing as the hybrids. So it's variable growth and they ripen at different times, so they can be quite problematic, but still better than traditional seed. Then we look at labor costs. So doing CA on this scale definitely saves a lot of money for people in terms of ploughing, because before they used to try and get those half a hectares ploughed by government services or the few people that have tractors in these villages, and it costs. So then we get people to compare these costs with the costs for the herbicides and the pesticides. So they make informed decisions about how they're going to manage their small operations. Okay, this leads, of course, into where do we get money to buy the inputs in the first place? So part of what we do is working with what we're calling village savings and loan associations. They're a bit like, a lot like Stokvels. They're more carefully managed in terms of transparency and in terms of being sure that money is managed in a way that the group is expecting it to be managed. And then also they have greater flexibility in terms of using the savings and in terms of getting your cash out. So they're designed to be able to support buying of inputs and production, as well as the consumption smoothing. So the Stokvels are generally used for buying food over Christmas time, so people are used to that. Then we start working with saying, okay, well, let's do these so that you can buy your inputs in September. So their group matures in September rather than December. So we're finding that in these savings groups that we're working with and help to set up, about 28% of the people in these groups are now using those savings for inputs, which doesn't sound like a lot, but initially they do it for consumption smoothing, so they need to buy food, they need to pay off the loans that they got from the mashonisas and where they've got into really bad debt. So it takes them a year or two or three to settle down and feel ready that they can now do this. Overall savings are small, but then we go back to overall income per month is really small. So 100 to 500 Rand per month is a significant amount for an individual to save. So generally what we're finding, if we average all this out, is that people are saving between 10 and 15% of their overall income for farming. The bottom pie chart here just shows how much people have saved in the last season. Because remember, we're working with people that are starting and that are in their second and third years. So as they go along, they tend to start saving a lot more. So, we have about 20% of the people that are saving between 2,000 Rand and 3,000 Rand and up for their inputs. Okay, just little bits make a large amount eventually. So if we look at these 15 saving groups that we're working with, between them they're saving almost R1 million a year, which is quite a lot if you think about it. So each person saves around R3,000 a year. And we're finding that this is the turning point for people in terms of being able to keep up production and keep on farming. The people that are involved in these groups do and can, and the ones that aren't. Because if you have a really bad year and you have a failed harvest, then mostly that's the end of it for them. People stop farming. But this creates a buffer from which they can continue. This is just very quickly the farmer centers when there's lots of smallholders involved. They're buying small quantities of stuff. So now some of the co-ops and the shops will sell small quantities, but they're proportionally that much more expensive. So in fact, it doesn't help the smallholder yet to do that. So the farmer centers, what they do is they buy in bulk and then they repackage it into smaller quantities for the farmers to buy locally. So you can walk to your farmer center and go buy your inputs there. And people really like that. But of course, we want them to be managed at a local level. So we wait for people to be ready to say, yes, I want to run a farmer center, and this is how I'm going to do it. We give them a little bit of seed funding, and then they take it from there. So this farmer center is in Isibomvini, one of the villages here in Bergville, and it's not, they're making about 850 Rand a month from that center. And for them, that's significant. They're very excited about it. Okay, I've just got a few slides now that gives us examples of some of the trials and trial participants and what they're doing. Here's Phumelele Hlongwane again. She's become our star farmer just because she got so excited about this, and she's doing absolutely anything and everything. So after 3 to 4 years of doing the trial, she's now decided that she doesn't need to use the herbicide on her trial plots, and she doesn't need to weed. So in fact, the close planting and the combination of cover crops has helped her deal with her weed problem. I think maybe next year she's going to have to weed again. Anyway, so there's increased organic matter. So for her, it's meant reduced fertilizer requirements. So she decided this year not to use any basal fertilizer, but only applied some top dressing. There's definitely reduced runoff from the slides I showed you earlier, and then increased yields and diversity. This year is a planting of dolichos with monocrop blocks of maize at the back. I think that's a control plot. This is sunflower, a mixture of, she decided to separate the sunflower and the sun hemp and millet that we were putting together as a summer cover crop mix because they want to harvest the sunflower seed. So for them, if they're growing a crop, you have to be able to get something back from it, even if it's good for the soil. So it has to be good for the soil which is fine. So this is for grazing, and these are then used for poultry feed. And this is her standing next to one of her intercrop plots. This is what her experiments looks like. She's got about 10 blocks. She does intercropping, crop rotation, plays with different types of legumes, and then summer and winter cover crops. So for her runoff plots, the average for the year, and they were monitoring this themselves between herself and her eldest daughter. That was also nice. So we start helping them to do some of the measurements by themselves. So the averages are quite different. For the CA plots is about just over 1 millimeter of runoff on average per rainfall event, and then for the conventional plots about 3 times more than that. Infiltration rates you can also see is much higher on the CA plots than the control plots. We looked at the soil health tests for her plots. She's now also got, so that's one of the other things that's crept in over time, because we tell them that if you're doing your control, you do what you normally do. That's your normal farming practice, and then we compare it against the CA. But as they start to like the CA, they start to incorporate the CA practices into their controls, and then by year 3 or 4, they're actually doing CA controls as well. So then sometimes, like with Phumelele, we did ask her then to say, okay, let's still do a conventional control so that you can compare the differences. Because now the differences, of course, are not going to be that high. So her CA microbial activity is just marginally higher than a CA control plot. The aggregate stability was between a CA and a conventional and a CA control. So there it is still quite a bit higher. And that seems to be because of the diversification. So if you just plant maize, 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 which he does on the control, the aggregate stability is a lot lower than it would be for a diversified crop mix. Her percentage organic matter in her soil is nice and high. It's about 3.5%. So it has increased significantly for her. It started below the felt baseline, which we used 4 years ago, and it's now gone up. And then we look at, so we try and do measurements to corroborate people's feelings that she was saying, okay, I think I don't need that much nitrogen. My crops are growing really well. I don't think I need to put so much nitrogen on. So we did the analysis of how much nitrogen there still is in the soil. And so there's still about 9 to 30 kgs per hectare of immediate release nitrogen in her soils, which basically justified her decision not to put the basal fertilizer on. Here are some results in terms of her yields. So her maize control was about 9.7 tons this year, up a little bit from last year. Her trial, which is combined between all those different plots, was a bit lower at 8.3, but I can't remember whether we did the LER there. Sorry. For intercropping plots, you have to sort of adjust the yield for a plot, and I'm not sure we did that. Anyway, beans, about 1.81 tons, so her beans are a lot better than most people's in the area, and she even got a bit of a yield off her sunflowers. So for some of the people who take this seriously, we follow them quite closely, and then also look at what they decide they want to do. So Smepi Nkosi from Eqeleni, she's decided to do her own variations of trials rather than to stick to the trial designs that we initially introduced. So she's now intercropping maize and sunflowers. She does single block plantings of millet because she thinks that increases her soil structure and her organic matter most. For her, that's the best option. She also has some GM maize, a plot of that on the side. And then with her intercropping, she set up her own design where she uses wider spacing because she uses traditional runner beans. And in fact, these beans actually yield quite well. I think they're a local variety that have seeds been passed around for some time, and they seem to be more acid tolerant actually than the varieties we're introducing. So these kinds of things are very interesting, and we'll take other farmers to go and see what she's doing, and you can compare different things. So you could ask why does the GM look a little bit like this? And why is the OPV maize not, where the stand isn't very even? So that's one of the things that people say is, but the OPV looks messy. You're going, no. In southern KZN, there's a mix of systems, so there are households, and there are larger fields, so working with cooperatives. Around the Bergville area, people have had more freedom to have fields close to their homes because it hasn't been set out. So they have larger areas close to home, and there's not much difference between a field and a garden. Differentiation is kind of the same thing. In southern KZN, it's more specifically laid out. Here again, they do the same thing. It's mixtures of OPVs and hybrids and GMs all being planted together, being supported by various people, maybe the Department of Agriculture, maybe our sister Grain SA program who promotes the planting of GM. So one of the things we noticed there is that people were a bit gung-ho with the herbicides. And they got confused between, do I actually have a GM variety here or is it? So here, for example, he managed to kill his soybeans and his maize because he sprayed Roundup mid-season. This is a bit of gramoxone damage from wind blowing. So it kind of shows us where we need to focus in terms of what people need to get the hang of. This is a GM trial, and then this is our intercropping trial. So here people were saying we like the OPVs and the hybrids because for them they realize, oh, okay, the yields are actually kind of similar to GM, because one of the things that doesn't happen in a smallholder environment is you don't get, the yield increase isn't that significant with a GM. Because say the highest yields that they can get from their hybrids is about 8 to 11 tons this year. And for their GMs, they were getting the same. So they would ask themselves the question, is it worth paying that much more for the GM? For some people it is, because with the herbicides and the spraying, it's much easier to manage. than having to do weeding. But people prefer the older varieties for eating. The GM maize tends to be a bit tasteless and bitter. And then they feel that intercropping is good because it increases the vigor of the maize, so they notice that within the first season. And then planting with the beans also provides an alternative income stream. So different areas, people respond slightly differently to this. But overall, in summary, we're finding that CA is increasing yields, it's improving people's livelihoods, and it's improving soil quality for around 300 smallholder farmers in KZN. Thanks. Just we produced a manual on using these experiences. So if people are interested in them, I've got a couple of copies here, so you can come get from me. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to know the percentage of adoption from the farmers, because in villages there's a lot of skepticism when you bring in new method vis-a-vis the old traditional conventional methods. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're not working with is percentage adoption as a concept. It's assuming that there is a body of farmers there and that a certain percentage of them is going to adopt this new idea that you're suggesting to them. What we're working with is farmers who are prepared to do farming and how they want to change their farming to make it better, and we're supporting them in that. So for us, it's interesting to know that it's increasing. So we know that the interest was small initially. People, it's a very new concept for people not to plow. They think it's quite silly, actually, to be honest. Initially, they just go, no, this is really ridiculous. No, give it a go, give it a try. So that's partly why we do the experimentation. So they get to get a feel for it. So for us, the fact that we double the number of participants that want to do trials every year is a major success.
Thank you for your talk. I think it's a huge encouragement for us to see the adoption in conservation agriculture. I want to know if you're open to extending it to other areas in Natal or even other provinces.
Yes. Short answer, yes. Absolutely.
Thank you. That was a nice presentation. One of the reasons why I say it's a nice presentation is because coming from Lesotho, I can easily, relate with what you're doing. And for me, I'm already thinking maybe there could be some lessons that we can learn from there, or even some collaboration so that we can actually organize our way in a way that you have done. I think like the previous person, previous to the other one, who was saying, what are the challenges that you are actually meeting, like the rate of adoption, looking into the fact that you find that people are, you have a mix of people, smallholder farmers. But where I'm driving at is also, are you considering mixing that with the livestock farming, which is one of the practices that we have in Lesotho?
Yes, of course. Sorry, it didn't come out very clearly. The cover crop mixes that we used are for grazing. And so people are setting up systems to ensure, well, it depends. In some areas, there's very little herding and there are no fences. In some areas, the herding is better. And so it depends on the area, and we negotiated at village level what's going to happen. But generally, people, of course, try to prefer that their own livestock graze on the cover crops that they've produced, or they sometimes will cut and store and then feed their livestock in the kraals. So I think we're getting ready slowly to deal with the whole grazing management issue as a big thing. We wanted people to get used to it and to see a change in their cattle's condition. And even these little bits seem to make quite a significant difference. So now people are getting ready to tackle the grazing management issue at a village level. Generally, when you start, it's a big conflictual issue which no one seems to manage to make much headway in, so they're quite scared of going there. But when they realize that actually we can work together, there's positive things, we can actually get our cows through winter doing this, and we can get cows in good condition in summer. So it will help our oxen be in better condition to do the ploughing when spring comes. So those kind of things are re-motivating them, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, to deal with these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of the implements that you are using, do you have a reliable source? Are they locally produced, which we could be in a position to get benefit out of it?
Yes to both the questions. So that was one of the things that we took care about, because we've seen in previous processes where CA was promoted that one of the reasons why it collapses is the expense of the inputs, and then the other is lack of implements. People couldn't find them. So we've been working very closely with local manufacturers. There are a couple of companies now, some of them are here, some of them are not here this year, who are producing these. We work closely with the reps. They come and see us. They come and look at how their equipment is doing in the field. They make changes. They improve them. So it's actually very exciting, and it's slowly but surely building, and I think it's becoming a stable market. It's becoming an option in a way that some of the co-ops will have these tools available in their shops. Thanks.
Right, in the same breath as what we have heard her now, we've got our Dominee as well. You know, he's not only a Dominee that comes and tells us what to do and how to think right, but he also does a lot of work where his whole outlook of carrying the word of God is to get the people working in the land as well. So here you're going to see the do's and the don'ts. I think he's also got a lot of years experience, and he's got a lot of things, pictures especially, that he's going to show us what he would suggest does work and does not work.
What I have to share is not rocket science, it's common sense. It developed over years. It developed out of mistakes. It developed out of making really a mess of a lot of things that we did. And that's why we are maybe so hard-headed about it. And if I come over too strong, sorry, I'm called a passionate pastor. I'm supposed to preach when I feel passionate about something. How can we change this wonderful continent we live in? How can we get a movement going that this continent just moves into a completely different league with food production? And I'm sorry, but I'm not into 3D printing my food. I'm not going to go there. I really liked Angus's approach, and did you see how passionate he is about it, and how people come and buy their products because it is real. And if I'm to think of Africa, Africa is going to be the place where this can be done. The rest of the world, it's possible, but it's harder. We can do it, and I'm specifically thinking of our rural subsistence farmers. Sorry, 3D printing of my food. I'd rather walk with my gun there on the farm and shoot my kudu and then make my wors. So the aim is to change lives. The aim is to change communities and to see great agriculture. And my story started in a little church there in Tebelong, a small village up in the mountains of Lesotho. You had to cross the Orange River to get to our village. And it started there in that church where I was preaching to the people, and I struggled to preach to them. How can I preach to these people who are hungry? So, plans. I'm always a guy for plans. So let's make a plan. Let's build some greenhouses. Let's get some employment going. Let's grow some tomatoes. And we grew some tomatoes, I tell you. Many of you have heard the story. Sorry for you who've heard it already. But what a bad idea. I mean, what a bad idea to come in with massive capital injection and to make this huge structure stand and grow tons of tomatoes every week in a village to get rid of. And you don't change one single person's life, and nobody can copy what you're doing. So then we thought, okay, this isn't working, and the agriculture looks terrible. The soil erosion is bad. The yields are extremely low in most of Lesotho. We're sitting at anything between 0.4 of a ton to 1 ton a hectare. So it's really, really difficult. So now we want to change the agriculture. How are we going to do this? It's easy. You get people together and you start to teach them. Some of them are sitting here who's on that picture. And we thought, okay, this is the aim. We want to see absolutely fantastic agriculture. So let's teach the people. But now you've got to move them from teaching to actually go and doing. And that's where the difficult part lies. So how do we do this? Well, it's actually very easy, you know. You just get the US involved and you hand food out and you tell the people, you know, you need incentives. We need to incentivize you. So you cannot do this farming. The CA is really hard work. So what should we do? We should help you to do this. We feed you. We give you food. And then we'll give you fertilizer and we give you seed so that you can go and do this. Nice idea, huh? If I wasn't a pastor, I would have said it's a shitty idea. We did this. Our farmer numbers, I mean, we started off with a group of farmers. There was a group of about 50 people at my gate one morning begging for food, and then we started training them, and it grew to 100. And then, as soon as we included big organizations and money, and food that came in, and fertilizer and seed, my goodness, our farmer numbers soared to 500 farmers overnight. Within a year or two, we were working with 500 farmers, and we felt, my goodness, we're making progress. This is success. Until we stopped the incentives, and our farmer numbers dropped to a handful of farmers. Go back to Tevelong now. Go and look how many farmers are there who are doing conservation agriculture as we teach it, Farming God's Way. It's a handful of farmers. And then, every now and then, a big organization will pitch up and say, whoa, let's give them fertilizer and seed. If they do CA, boom, all the farmers are back. Yeah, they're doing CA again. And there's absolutely no progress. I think that was very, very hard for us to see that what we thought was a great idea was actually really, really bad practice. You don't change people's lives. So the first thing was massive capital investment, and we see these capital investments all over our country with these greenhouses that plastic are flying in the air, and tractors being handed out, and it doesn't work, people. We don't make any progress. That was the biggest lesson we learned, was forget about this massive capital investment and so on. The second one was stop incentives. Full stop. Just stop it. You don't get anywhere. So luckily, God gave us a new start. We were able to move to Maputseng, where we established the training facility, and we said no incentives. We said, this is it. We'll teach farmers. And The problem is, and I have shown this slide in previous presentations here, is that we work on the outside circle. We work on the consequences. We work on bad agriculture. We work on the problem that people don't have seed and fertilizer and so on. And we don't realize that the consequences in people's lives come from their behavior. That lies a layer deeper. But your behavior is shaped by your values. That's even a layer deeper. So if, and your values are shaped by your belief system. What do you believe about stuff? And ultimately your faith lies right in the center of everything. But when we do development, many times we're stuck on the outside circle. And it was so nice to hear Anna speak. And underlying, could you hear how the farmers are involved, how the farmer can make his decisions, how the farmers start to believe in something, and then the farmer starts to run with something. That's what you're after. That is when change will come. So we are really looking for a place where agriculture is spectacular. I was, in June, July, I was on that field, on that maize field, and I was harvesting the maize with a group of students for the farmer. We just go into this community every year, just be with them, just help them harvest, just take the maize off the cobs and so on. That slope, you can see the angle of that slope. It is tremendous. And I couldn't find any soil erosion on that slope. Because the guys will cut the chichis, they'll cut anything, grass, they'll lie it there, the old maize stalks. There's a cover on that soil, like you'll struggle to beat. So, we're looking for farmers whose lives have changed. We're looking for farmers who grow food like this, and this is the guy. Modiko, what's his name? You know his name? Don't worry. But, I mean, this is one of our farmers up in Monyameng, and this is one of our prize communities, where I'll tell you their story now, but I mean, we're after just fantastic yields. And again, we helped to harvest the field of this lady when we were there with the students. Open pollinated seeds, cobs, this size, this long. I couldn't believe my eyes. It's just, and she sat there and she said, okay, I want this and this. And she picked her cobs out and she lined it up there and said, there's my seed for next year. No seed input costs that needs to be bought. I said, your fertilizer? No, I didn't put any fertilizer. It was, again, the cover, the soil that's been regenerating itself. It's a little bit of manure. I don't know, Jaap, do we have a yield count on that lady? I think it's 12 tons plus for that lady from that field. But this is what we're after. We're after a community that's doing it, where more and more farmers every year starts to do it, where other farmers come and they learn from them and they take the knowledge away and they start to do it in other communities. And we're looking for communities where they start to sell their food. And this is the process that we're after. But how does that happen? How do you get to that place? And this is such a beautiful story. It's about these two brothers, Ntati Fusi and Ntati Otsila. These two guys, they drove past Maputseng, our place, up into the valley, because they're way up into the mountains. You can't get there with a vehicle. And they drove past our place, and they started talking in their community. They said, there's something happening down there. We want to know what's happening down there. And they got together, and the chief said, all right, you two go. You go and ask what's happening down there. They walked down out of the mountains, hours to get to us. Luckily, we were busy with training with some pastors at that point in time. This was 9 years ago. And they joined the training, and they heard what should be happening. They heard about soil erosion. They said, that's the problem on our fields. And you walk up into that valley when you go there, and you see this really, really bad erosion as you go up. And then you start to see the CA plots. You see them in these mountains, against the mountains, how they just stand up like all the others. But these two guys walk back into their community. And they said, people, do you see the erosion? This is why we need to change. We need to change the way we're farming. We need to do conservation agriculture. And they taught their community. And we started to work to those people. Do we have a percentage, Jaap, of how many people have adopted? Yeah. 60%, 68%? 60-70% of that community are conservation agriculture farmers. Now, that's spectacular for any community. It happened because two guys from their community walked up there and started teaching people and showing them the way and practicing it, come back for more information. Then we started walking up into that, but it was farmer driven. It was their initiative versus an organization that was pushing it. And this is the same story with our next community in Haledinyani. These people they just took what we taught them to a new level. They were again at a training. They walked back up into their village and they saw that simple experiment that they've got up here, that runoff experiment, and they said, we've got to cover our soil. And they started covering their soil with grass. And they've got mulch just really, really, really thick. I mean, they do not do weeding anymore. They have no weed problems. They don't use any fertilizer. They just put a little bit of manure underneath the blanket. Their potatoes, they just put them underneath the blanket and stack some more mulch on top of it, and then the potatoes will come through. But anyway, it's again a community who started working together. And it started very small, and it started expanding. And when you sit with these guys on their fields, and this old man starts to talk to you, and he tells you, we were in the land of Egypt. We were slaves. We had nothing to eat. Our soil was gone. But now we live in the land of Canaan. Now, that is what you're after, where these farmers really start to get excited about their soil, and, sorry for the bad picture, but where droughts become irrelevant. You know how bad the droughts have been the last few years. This radish was planted in the worst drought in 100 years in Lesotho. Because the droughts just do not affect these people anymore. With a mulch this thick on your land, they always have a crop standing, and they always have a green root in their soil. If you look at their maize, before their maize matured, they put in their crops in between, wheat. They'll do wheat, peas, beans, carrots, beetroot, everything just goes in, and there's always a green root in that soil. Just spectacular what has happened in this community. And when those farmers start to talk about soil, and when they put their hand underneath the mulch and they pick up their soil, then you realize, my goodness, you've got absolute gold here with these farmers. And not one little bit of incentive, not one bag of seed or fertilizer or anything was given to them. It was knowledge. It was training. It was helping them to understand the principles. And what's happening now? They live on the road. And the people who walk up into the mountains stop at their place. Talk to us. Now the message is walking up back into the mountains. And they can take you now to communities that they have trained. When we look at our own place, down at Maputseng, where the project is, my people have just said yesterday again, you know, it's as if up there, it's much better than down here. I said to them, you know why? It's because we as an organization are teaching these people. Those people up there being taught by farmers. So the farmers are the ones who are taking the message up there. Now, one of the biggest challenges, we've had just the last one on what their crops looks like. It's just so lush always there. And although there's very hardly or very little rain, it always looks like this. You can see wheat in here, there are peas in there, those and radishes I can see. So the challenge to get a farmer to that level, there's just one thing that can spell it, and that's time. It's time and investment, where you don't take him to a hotel for training. You go and sit there with him on his field, and where you teach him. That's where things change. I think one of the biggest challenges we're faced with are the different messages that come to these farmers from different organizations. That's why we love working with the farmers way up in the mountains. Everybody else don't want to walk up into the mountains to get to these farmers. So we love working with these farmers in the remote areas because the message gets unfiltered. But now, there's one farmer who stands out because we've trained them. Then an organization will pitch up. Oh, you're doing great work, you know. We want to encourage you to do better work. Here's a bag of fertilizer and seed. And I want to pull my hair out of my head. Because there goes all the good work we've tried to do with this farmer, where he goes and buys his seed, where he takes ownership, where he starts to teach other people. No, I've got to do, you know, you think you're doing good by giving people incentives, but we're making such a mess of people's attitude and their drive and so on. And then other people will do it just to get the incentives. But their heart isn't in it, and you make no progress. And so we sit with a sad situation that 3-4 organizations will report on one farmer just because he's made some good progress. And there's some of the farmers sitting here told me their story yesterday from Lesotho. It's a challenge for us. Who should we listen to? So, money and organizations and driving it with incentives, people, we are messing up farmers if we do that. So the biggest lesson we've learned is money can be really bad when you go into our rural communities in Africa. Training there in the hotel rooms, yeah, you blow all the donors' money because you've got to get rid of a whole heap of money. So how do you do it? You buy truckloads of fertilizer and seed, and you hand it out and take people to a hotel and pay big bills, and that's how you get rid of your money. But do you change lives? Do you really sit there in the village with somebody? One of the other challenges we have is the average age of our farmers. 55 is the average age of the farmers we work with. And it brings a whole set of challenges on its own. Now we're working with a youth program as well, where we have people for 1 year to come to our place. We're struggling with that as well to make a real success out of it, but we're trying. Cattle is a massive issue. And what we've found is, as soon as people start to work more in groups, there's a group of farmers. It's not one single farmer, that lonely social rejected path that you walk. But if there's a group of farmers working together and a group of farmers going to the chief together, then you make more progress than when you only have one single farmer complaining about the cattle on his fields. I've said it already, but it's got to be community driven, not organizational driven. If the communities drive these things, you'll get somewhere. We've started now this year with a competition where farmers will be competing against each other, and the best farmer will get something, or best farmers. Movement. How do we get a movement running? And our donor, Canadian Food Grains Bank, with the Mennonite Church from Canada, asked us the other day, said, okay, you've got 50 farmers. That's not really a lot of bang for our buck. You sit only with those group of farmers, but our other projects have got hundreds or thousands of farmers for the same money. He said, but let's filter it down. I went to my staff, I said, go and work out, how many farmers do those lead farmers that you work to influence? And our energy goes into a small group of farmers, and they are starting to influence others, and they influence others. And we have a radio program, and as soon as we started to add up these numbers, we realized, my goodness, we're working with thousands of farmers actually, but for our donors it looks like we're working with 50, but small is good. Work rather intensively with a small group of farmers and change their lives, and a movement will start. And just before I left Lesotho, it's the baby that we gave birth to over the last years, well, the last 23 years I've been in Lesotho. That's what culminated in my work in Lesotho, was this project that we started. And I was challenged to leave Lesotho and start a new work, and there was doubt in my heart. Has the movement started? And Modiko came to me and he said, there's a TV program about our farmers this weekend, this evening on the television. We're going to Mohalishoek to go and watch this. So we went to the hotel, and there we sat in the hotel room and we watched our farmers. As we sat there and our farmers told their stories, I said, I can go. My work is done. The movement has started. It's small. There's not a lot of hectares under CA in Lesotho, but the movement of farmers have started. They are telling the story. It's not August Besson telling the story anymore, or the trainers. It is the farmers who are telling the story. And that's why it will just increase and it won't be able to stop. And of course, it's so nice to get farmers to really start to work and live with joy, and to help farmers to live with dignity, and to tell their story to you with dignity. And we've got hundreds of stories of farmers whose lives have changed. And then, sorry Erna, I'm going to step here on your toes, but it was us who made the same mistake. And maybe it's not a mistake in your case, but the GMs. We just felt, it's such a struggle for these farmers to control their weeds. And we started implementing and selling GMs. We planted GMs, we sold it. One day, I was up in that one community, Monyameng, that first community that I told you about. And again, with the students, we were helping to harvest the field. And there was this maize copse. Then this thing is this long, and then this is this long, and then there's a red one, and then there's a yellow one, and then I couldn't believe what my eyes saw. It was the funniest stuff I've ever seen in a maize field, in one field. And I said to the guy, what's this? I said, where did you get the seed? He said, from you. I stood there and I realized under big conviction what we've done. So we've promoted GM crops. Those GM crops have walked up into the mountains of Lesotho. The people's open pollinated varieties that they've been farming with for hundreds of years are being contaminated now. And now we sit with this. And this guy's just kept his seed, and every year he plants his GM seed, carries on, and he doesn't even use Roundup anymore. But now it's contaminating all those seeds. We've stopped it completely. Said, this is not where we're going. We're going the open pollinated route. We're not going the 3D route. We're going the sustainable route. But it's these hard lessons that you learn when you work with communities. You think, you act in wonderful intention. Many times with donors' money, but you mess lives up. So, I can't preach without a challenge. There will always be a challenge. We sit with how many farmers here? How many of you own 4x4s? Come put up your hands. I have one. I have more than one. Put up your hands. Come on, you lie. There are more 4x4s than just the hands that are up. How many of us like to go into Africa? How many of us like to get out into the bush? I want to challenge you to take your car and your family, drive into the bush. If you don't know where to go, ask Erna. Give me a farmer's GPS coordinates. And you go and visit with a farmer. Take your vehicle, drive to a community. Pitch up there in a community. I tell you, you'll be so surprised with the hospitality you find in rural Africa. And then, please don't take the people's stuff. Go and sit with them around the fire. Start to talk to them because they're all farmers. And we can take the message of conservation agriculture, farming God's way, into Africa. And we sit with a network now throughout Africa with our Farming God's Way network of communities that have started Farming God's Way, or CA, or Conservation Agriculture, whatever you want to call it. But you can do that. How can we upscale Erna's work? Erna is only one person with a bit of funding from, the maize, whatever. Sorry, Hendrik. But anyway, we can all do our part. And we can all change one community's life. And that's how we can change this continent. if we go and impart what we've learned with other people and we pass it on. Amen. I'm finished. There is actually time for a question or two. Don't ask difficult questions. What do you mean call to? Oh, okay. So I just needed to get to a place where I can cross more boundaries, borders. The old founding father was still around. Modiko and Rorisang and the other guys needed to grow. And I had to move away so that they can do their own thing and I can move away and start a new thing. So what I'm doing now is I'm mobilizing Africans for missions. We sit with 900 unreached people groups. I want to find new creative ways. How can we get our Africans involved in mission without the traditional mission model? Because it's not working for Africa. So I'm the pioneer to try to shake up this mission scene. And then I do Farming God's Way training all over the place. I was in Iraq last year. That was an amazing story. I'm going to show you some pictures of that. And then I'm going to Peru in October to go and train people there. So where I'm needed, I go. But my main job is to mobilize Africans for missions. Amen. Bye.
August, is there a way that our No-Till Club could assist in spreading the word, possibly electronically? We've had the challenge of having an app which would go with the phones that are spreading. The banks are using it everywhere in Africa. But we'd like to possibly think of something along those lines where I haven't got a 4x4, I can hardly see where I'm driving, so but I can possibly run something on a computer that would get to an app in Ethiopia.
Wow, I like that idea. I think there's a combination of things here. An app like that would work brilliantly, and you can contact Vodacom. That guy that I put you in touch from Vodacom, Fawn, I don't think he's come back to you.
No.
Okay, sorry.
And I don't think he's so good.
We should get the right guy onto you. He was just the guy that was supposed to make the connection, but I'll talk to him. But Vodacom is working on an app where they link farmers so that they can link subsistence farmers all over with markets. And that was the whole idea. And I was trying to get him here so that he can just say, this is what we're trying to do and network with people. But then I think Haley has got such incredible ideas with short videos. And I think we need on that app, we need these short, brilliant little videos, because even our shepherd boys up in the mountains have got phones. They can read and write, but they can operate the phone. So, I mean, I think we are in an age where we can really spread the message that way. So, Modiko, we need to sit with Richard.
Well, that's what we're basing on Haley's idea.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's where money will be so well spent. You know, the other thing is, I think we need to start to push on curriculums and school curriculums and get CA into the curriculums. When you've taught something to a child, he just doesn't veer off it, you know. So if we can not show them, oh, this is conventional, this is this, but teach them CA, you know, they'll never go away from it. Anyway.
So this just.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, August. A great presentation. It's the Maize Trust. In any case, what I want to clarify is what Erna said is, in our program, we try to stick within the policy, in the Cartenigo protocol, actually. That is to not introduce GM crops into these areas, so we don't use GM crops. But what is happening there, and what Erna is trying to picture, is there's so many other organizations bringing GM crops without following the protocol. They're all around, next to our plots, and that's why she's included it into those slides as well, just trying to say what's happening, the reality on the ground in these communities.
For sure.
So we try to stick within the policy, which is trying to protect the biodiversity of these communities. In actual fact, their local seed systems. You stick within those rules.
But you stuck with the policy. I was outside the policy.
Yeah.
You're not allowed in Lesotho. So anyway.
Exactly. you're nowhere.
Let Jack Sparrow have the last word.
Really, it's an interesting part. Egon is one of our most knowledgeable farmers in cover crops. He does most of his farm in cover crops. So yeah, thank you very much, Egon, for sharing. He's a very well informed person, and we're definitely looking forward to all your inputs. Thanks, Egon.
Just recently returned from a trip to the States again with Case IH, having bought the latest combine, so we got a trip. I think the price was thrown in anyway. But it was very interesting. We'll get to what I found on this recent trip. What I want you to know is it's sort of the presentation I put together is based on numerous trips. So I've been fortunate to be able to go odd times. I've been to quite a few no-till conferences there. The most difficult one on this recent trip was to try and find out what the trends are. And just drawn one conclusion, that I should have been on the trip with Landbou Werkblad and Marlene Smith and them. A couple of things that I picked up, and please bear in mind this is from numerous trips, numerous conferences, etc. This is from the recent no-till one, where it said no-till farmers are 12% more efficient than guys that till. That comes from Purdue University in the States. This is, you might recognize somebody in the picture as well, a speaker that's going to come up tomorrow. And the guy in the white shirt is David Hula, and for those who don't know him, he's the world corn champ, having grown the world record maize yield. Humble fella, church-going guy. We were fortunate to visit him on 2 consecutive days in Virginia. What's interesting too, the local maize record here is not in the traditional maize growing areas. He's on the silt down in the bottom in Virginia near the coast. It's definitely not in the maize belt or the corn belt in Iowa. Anyway, that's who we visited, and so we toured around his farm and asked him a few questions and things, and so I've got a few interesting slides on how they go about it. We'll get to the no-till side, Nana. That's his Terrogator, as you can see, and they distribute their fertilizer and limes and things with that machine. High flotation tires, which is self-explanatory. Then we get to the interesting stuff, is the planter. And with all these visits to the States, I've become quite frustrated in trying to find a no-till planter. Most of these guys you get to and you say, "You doing no-till? Yeah. Where's your no-till planter?" And you get this puzzled look. I say, "But that's our planter, and it's what we would call a conventional planter." Now, in my history, I started off with a John Deere 7000 with coulters. We went to a 1750 with coulters, added some Yetta row cleaners. So we've done the no-till American way, but got frustrated because of the penetration, poor penetration, and poor standard we were getting. So we went to the Brazilian type heavier planters that penetrate better. The interesting thing on this planter, as we were discussing with him, is what he's doing, and nobody will give you the full recipe, but some of the secrets, as he's shared even on some pioneer days that he addressed here in South Africa, is like your seed treatment and then the sweets. That tank on top there is what supplies the sweets, if you want to call it. It's a whole mixture of, including growth stimulants and stuff that they dribble in onto the row. So you would have liquid fertilizer that is usually sort of 2 by 2, 2 inches by 2 inches, to the side and down from the seed. Then they have this tank that dribbles the trace elements and the stimulants and etc., and some of the stuff that we couldn't find out what it is, that dribbles down in on the seed furrow. So these are sort of add-ons, but a word of warning while we're on this, and as it comes to mind, is don't rush for all these fancy attachments. I'm not saying don't go get them. Don't start by saying, I'm going to get my yield by adding all these fancy attachments and dribbling this little bit and that little bit. The foundations, I would say, are like 95% of your yield. So you just do the basics right. Just like the Sharks, if they just start playing basic rugby or Springboks even, you start getting a hang of a lot right. And then you can fine-tune your little Sonny Bill Williams backward flip passes and stuff. And that's what the cream, the real cherry on the cake, is these guys are squeezing the last, as they say, spoon feeding their crops. That's a typical fertilizer culture that they would add to the conventional stroke no-till planters. There are numerous add-ons in the market that include row cleaners, sparked closing wheels if your furrow doesn't want to close. I brought back a whole booklet on how to turn your planter into a no-till machine. And it's all just add-ons that you can add to your planter to fix what's not happening right. Now, I would like to try something like that on one of these big fold-up planters and have a dry fertilizer chute there. But that's a story for another day. So we asked him about no-till, and he says, yeah, 40 years. And having seen his fields and having all these questions that I experienced in my travels around this country about the sandy soils, this was an important question. We said, oh, well, when do you rip? I mean, those are the questions get thrown at us. And he was puzzled. He said, no, 40 years, no-till, yes. What's the problem? And I'll just leave that with you. I think it'll stimulate a lot more ideas in your head than if I try and explain it all out. That was a typical field, I wouldn't say that is David Hula's, but in that Virginia area, where that could have been wheat. It's probably a cereal rye, which stopped as we were going along on our travels. It's been what you would call turbo-tilled, worked finally just to create that flat cover like that. And I think that's the real success with all these huge fold-up planters of theirs. They just plant into an easy seed bed. That's sort of the typical turbo-till, as we want to call it. I think it's been coined by Great Plains. But a slightly angled disc it's running through. Some would have a ripple on it, some would be smooth. That's what they cut their material with. I'll get back to a bit more of that when I explain what I saw at the Farm Progress show. That would be a typical small grains drill. If it looks a bit complicated, it's folded up. It folds open from the front back, so it forms a nice wide planting drill. Cutting disc in the front, the double disc seed placing unit, and then your closing wheel. You also have a range of closing wheels that you could have. Farming in sandier soils in the Free State and trying to establish winter crops and that type of stuff, I would think this type of closing wheel would be better. It would press down into the furrow. But you'd have to adapt that for your own area. This would also be used for planting cover crops. This is a field of a farmer nearby there, also in Virginia area, that had his wheat crop rejected by the local elevator, as they call it, where they deliver the grain, due to aflatoxins. So no problem. Came back to his farm and took out the spreader and spread his whole wheat crop on his farm. And that's the result. And of course it looks very lush and like the Midlands, and like when we started off with cover crops, it's only for these guys. Look at that weather and look at that climate, you know. But he took his whole wheat crop that was rejected and spread it on his whole farm, and there he had a cover crop. But that's simply his rejected wheat crop that he spread on his fields to create cover, live root in the ground, etc. Then we jump to this last no-till conference that I visited in January. And to quote a few of the old renowned guys, if you read the No-Till Farmer, and even on the internet, you can look up Ray Wheel. A lot of experience. I gleaned a few things out of his talk. He said, bare fields only have 3 to 4 months use of sunshine and microbe activity. So simply, the factory is only operating 3 to 4 months in the year. That's taking the sunlight and creating carbon in the ground. So bare fields, besides the naked, hungry, and running a fever story, they're not operating. Farmers in Maryland. Maryland is around Washington there. For those who don't know, we saw a lovely picture. There was Neil that showed the phosphorus runoff causing that green surface sludge on the water. Chesapeake Bay has got this major problem with algae and contamination and stuff. And so Maryland is the farmland around that area where Washington, D.C. is. The farmers there were paid $45 up to $105 per acre to plant cover crops to mop up the surplus nutrients that are being washed through their soils and entering the Chesapeake Bay, causing all the problems. On a closer investigation on my own, I realized that there's a hang of a lot of industry around there, and it's just interesting that the farmers would be getting all the blame. But the farmers are getting paid to plant cover crops. There must be something in it for them to spend that money on incentivizing the farmers to plant cover crops. And so when you drive through the area, it looks like Nottingham Road in the summer. It's just fields, and some of them so small that you wonder if it's the guy's front lawn. But everybody's planted his cover crop. The problem there is if that incentive wasn't there, how many of those guys would be doing it? It's almost like the no-tillers who do it because they felt the heat and not seen the light. But they're growing it, and it is helping to a large degree to mop up the nutrients. The cereal rye is the main cover crop that they plant there. Stooling rye is what we would call it, sort of korok type of stuff. But the problem, in Ray Wheel's opinion, is it's planted too late. And so by the time it is rooted, that nitrogen's gone and it's in the system and down in the waterways. And the better idea is to plant brassicas, which fetch nitrogen deeper and release it faster again into your crop, so you don't have that negative N period in the next crop. One of the stops. I'm happy to field any questions about no-till in sandy soil. Took a handful of the stuff and I had to take a photograph of it to bring back home. Little did I know that one day I'd need it in a presentation like this. Yeah, planting in bee sand. It was very wet. If you realize the Virginia pictures, they were very wet. We were actually with a John Deere guy, we were chasing the new John Deere planter with a new seeding unit that sits at an angle and it drops the seed with a belt. So we traveled around there trying to find this thing, and we did eventually find it and see it, but it was not working all the time because it was so wet. So bear in mind, even like this picture here, this is saturated, but it's a cover crop that hasn't grown that well. So don't put yourselves down when your cover crop looks like that. It happens all over the world. You're just always just seeing the best pictures. This was probably killed with a paraquat type of spray. Then who we hoped to get here one day and we thought of getting this year was Steve Groff. You can also Google him, Cover Crop Innovations, stopped at his farm in Pennsylvania. He's surrounded by Amish farmers, but he's got a bit of a training center there, and he's recognized now also a 25-year service to the no-till farmer organization in the US. This was a Kinsey split row planter that he'd just taken it out to demo for us. The material on the ground is just some leftover wheat straw that he had, and he's just spread it out rather than waste it. He's using it on his field as cover. What you'll notice there too is the bits of vetch that are coming up right under that wheat straw. I haven't put too many of these pictures in. It just happened to be on his planter. There is an option. If your plant is not doing what it's doing, there is an option to put a modified wheel on, or a disc, or whatever it is. This was what they call stitch wheels. They almost zip the furrow closed. It's made of like a poly material, polycarbon. It's a view from Steve Groff's place. He obviously does cover crops because he's promoting it and he teaches on it. Again, not to put yourselves down when your cover crop's not wall to wall. This is like close to his house, and obviously that's the vetch flowering. You would have had clovers, closer view, vetch, clover, oatses, and they love their cereal rye there too. Then there was a talk at the No-Till conference by a guy called Ray McCormick from Indiana, just splattering them around to show that they're from all over the place, from just about no rain to the real wet coastal areas, Midwest, where it's supposed to be the Garden of Eden. Ray McCormick's from Indiana. He seeds rye, clover, rape, and radish in various combinations. Again, not to bore you with everything, the combinations would be put together for a certain need. And appreciate guys like Simon being around. You find them, have a chat. vast amount of information that you can get out of him on what to mix for what purpose. There must always be a purpose in what you're doing. And so you can have combinations that you want to build organic matter, or you want to save your nitrogen, or you want to build phosphorus, etc., etc. He saves his tires and equipment by seeding behind his Sawyer header. I've got a few pictures that are pinched off the internet that will explain that a little bit later. There's various ways of getting it in. They say where there's a will, there's a way, and you just find a way of getting your cover crop in. Bearing in mind, when you talk to guys at a no-till conference, you're going to find a concentration of passionate people like here that are all no-tillers, and they're all into cover crops, and they're all wanting to interseed. Then you get to the Farm Progress Show, and I don't see much progress being made in the form of conservation agriculture, but a little bit more of that later. The take-home message on Ray McCormick's talk was he saves 50 to 80 applied N after no-till and cover crops. Then we have the livestock factor. This was still in Pennsylvania, taken from Steve Groff's place. We've got pastures. If they don't have livestock, sometimes they're rented out to the neighbor just to introduce livestock into the system. There they are, common breeders, Black Angus. I suppose this was the hospital, but anyway, as I said, Steve Groff was surrounded by these Amish folk who he has a lot of input into their lives. They're big friends, and we were able to visit one of the farms and see all the machinery, how it works. But that's for another day. This guy had planted his cover crop and whatever, and he decided to green manure with it. And there was his, what's that, 6 horsepower? Not quite, but ploughing in his cover crop for green manuring. Pay attention to the surrounding fields. That's generally what it looks like in that area, because they just love their cover crops. They've seen the importance of it and the soil life that goes with it. Alan Minderman, who farms on the southern plains, he farms actually in what they call an Indian reserve area. So you could say in your traditional areas where nobody really wants to farm. The people have the land, but they're not doing anything with it. And he's been able to rent land there. And by doing that, he's able to go in, and he's got a longer-term lease. He had a battle to get past 1 year. But having a longer-term lease, he could actually introduce no-till and cover crops and regenerate that soil. And he's producing crops where nobody wanted to produce them before. So the average rainfall is, this is obviously converted for this conference now, 812 mils average rainfall. Last year he had 406 millimeters with a 2,540 millimeter measured evaporation. First comment was, how can you have more evaporation than the rain that fell? Hello, it's measured in an evaporation pan. So when the pan gets empty, you add water and you just keep measuring how much evaporation is taking place. This is indicative of what's happened in this area, in my area, I'm talking my own opinion, for the last 3 seasons. We might have recorded a little bit more rain than that. Our average is about 850. It's dropped from 950 in the last 10 years. It's easy with Excel. You just drag your mouse down and it gives you averages. In the last 10 years, it's gone from 950 to 867. And bear in mind what our average is, and what we've had in the last few years was like 492 and a 650 odd. I'd hate to know what our evaporation is, because it's been a real bizarrely hot oven door type of winter. He's been in no-till for 20 years, continuous no-till, and he plants odd crops in my vocab, like sesame, millet, mung beans, okra. He says, don't worry about Google and all these things. Go to Alibaba.com. It's a Chinese website and marketing platform. Find out what people are buying there and go and grow something to supply that market. So it takes a little bit extra to value add. And I couldn't resist just adding this one. I took a shot, just like nowadays, or in the old days when the teacher said, class, take notes, everybody's heads bowed and they wrote down with their pens. Today, if the teacher says take notes, they all lift their heads and pick up their cell phones and take a picture. Well, I took notes at this conference, and this is one of them. Here he's direct seeding winter peas into a standing cover crop of your Babala millet type of cover crop. These are courtesy to the internet. I pinched a few examples of seeders. This is the Kuhn Accelerator, one of our exhibitors, with Valmar. You get a lorry and all sorts of brands. Montag is here on that Ortman strip till machine. But basically it's to channel your seeds, your cover crop seeds, in behind the discs or in between them to incorporate cover crops on a large scale and at a rapid pace into the system while you've got moisture. This is more like we trying to achieve the APV, I think is marketed by Win Deadwith and them, Valtrac. We just got one of these, the tillage implement, I know. Decided to incorporate our lime and fertilizers and things just because of the huge losses we're getting in these violent winds. I think they're on the increase. We might be at the end of a hot cycle, I don't know. But that's our aim of incorporating the lime and minimizing the pain. And obviously this is also a practice elsewhere. I was speaking to a French lady, visited my farm the other day, and talking about Europe, and are they using Roundup? No, they can't use Roundup. So I said, well, they're doing no-till. Yes, they're doing no-till. My ears were up. How are you doing no-till without Roundup? Cut a long story short, this is how. Chop the material, bear in mind that the weeds then can't be too big because these discs aren't as aggressive as your conventional discs. So they would shallow disc the field and then plant and then continue with a conventional chemical program. This is also, as I mentioned, Ray McCormick earlier, one of the methods where they'd mount, in our South African terminology, we used to get Gandhi bins. It's one of the makes. You mount it on your combine header. I've seen some mounted on the tail of the combine. They would spread it onto the spreaders, would drop the seed onto the spreaders. There's little black plates there at the end of these pipes. Those are just merely distributors of the seed that comes out. It gets blown along those pipes and then it gets distributed onto those plates and down onto the ground. I think this is a better way of applying it than on the spreaders at the back, because then the seed will be on the ground before the material is spread over them. Also, courtesy of the USDA distribution, this is a 2012 census, but just simply percentage of cropland with cover crops. And there are your percentages. The red ones are what you need to look at. They should be green, but 15 to 56% of cropland with cover crops in those areas. The lot of white on the left, bear in mind, is not actually cropland, so it will also fall out of the system. These are also dependent on number of respondents. Having been there a few times, you just realize the size of the country, and the attitude of a lot of the people is not really participate. Much like we get here, you send out a survey and only a percentage will react. But that's just, I like pictures, it just gives you an idea. There's cover crops around. Maybe the disappointing thing is not as much as what I expected. There's an interesting talk that I attended by J.C. Kale, University of Alberta. You can take these down and go and look him up. Very interesting, an observation that I made in the crowd. The older generation, when I heard the average age of the farmer was like 55 or 54, I thought, yeah, a bunch of old fossils. Then I realized, well, I'm practically there. Well, I am there. But a lot of the older generation, even now when I was there now, what I classed as older generation, seemed to start fidgeting and shaking their heads that this guy was talking pie in the sky. But it was probably one of the more interesting talks that I attended. It was on how plants communicate, and if you really want to look it up, there's a lot of stuff on that. We've had some speakers touching on it, even Jill Clapperton visited Pioneer on a previous trip as well, where they explained where they potted weeds and placed them in maize rows. So now concentrate, listen carefully. They potted these weeds so they had no effect on the roots of the maize plants in these trials. And they placed these potted weeds, which they'd fertilized and fed, in these pots. They placed them in the rows, and then they measured the reaction to the maize, of the maize to these weeds. And so in our terminology, we could say the maize saw those weeds, and the row that had these potted weeds in them grew 19% more vegetatively than the rows that didn't have the weeds in. So it wasn't the root competition, it was just the presence of those green weeds in the row. Yeah, you could go down the road of light interception, light reflection, refraction, all that. There was an effect. Plants are not as stupid as we think. Plants grown with kin, like plants, produced more roots than those that were not grown with kin, only when fertilized. So this, it sounds like, oh, why am I sharing this? It applies to our agriculture. You're planting like with like, maize, and they're fertilized. They produce more roots than those which are not, or which are not planted with kin. Some of his observations, and he does extensive studies on that, he's commissioned to only do this type of work. Most plants grow their roots towards the fertilizer, and more so with dicots than monocots, so beans more than maize. He had a explanation in a slide up with two pots, but the same plant planted in these pots. So the roots were split between the two pots. And the one pot was fertilized and the other was not. At the end of the experiment, the fertilized pot was full of roots and the other one not. So that plant knew to send its roots. You can say it's got a brain, it hasn't. But the roots, obviously, by the fertilizer multiplied, and they consequently were able to harvest all that fertilizer. Just interesting how plants behave. Let the shutters not go down, as I explained earlier too. When things don't apply, we sort of seem to switch off. These things all apply to our cropping systems, and all that we've been learning here about no-till and everything. All these are pertinent. That's why I bring them into a talk like this. Then some plants release a chemical that attracts the enemies, the attacker's enemy. They had a plantation of trees, example, and infected the first tree with these bugs and damaged the leaves. That tree sent out a signal, and 7 trees later, the signal ran out and the bugs attacked the trees 7 trees away. So from that one tree being injured and damaged by these bugs artificially, it sent out a signal that affected 6 other trees around it. They say plants don't communicate. They do. This all comes into play now when we're starting to figure out which plants go with which are allelopathic to others. It's a huge subject. I just found it very interesting, and also courtesy of the internet has pinched this off a picture really showing, I don't want to pinch my mate's picture here. Bruce will be talking tomorrow. He pulled rows out of his Tatu wheat planter and did exactly this. And I think at this stage it's apt to say, don't go running all over the world looking for stuff. Us South African farmers are doing it. I was really impressed with my Free State colleagues up there, Isak Dreyer and them, with Grain SA, and I commend Vrystaat Landbou as well. We've commissioned people, Jaco and Suzette and them were here attending this conference, where they've been commissioned to promote no-till and conservation agriculture. So the thing's taking off. But that's simply interseeding. I don't want to go into all the pros and cons, but you would simply be putting down seed at this stage of the crop, and apparently from V4, V6 onwards, that plant that's going to be growing in the row underneath that maize crop will not be competition. And that's what it would sort of look like. I think this was done on very bare soil. I would go with a single row in between the rows. So you're getting your root effect anyway. And of course, the narrower the rows, the better, until you get light interception. So there's a balance between how much sunlight gets in to keep that interseeded, companion, underseeded crop. Sounds like a lot of gibberish, but that's what it looks like. This is a picture of an interseeder. If you want to look what it looks like, it's a simple double disc. Right next to the double disc, you'll see a little plate that comes down, and I figure that's to stop the disc from lifting sticky soil and blowing a big furrow open. And then just a simple closing wheel at the back. You could fiddle with a smorgasbord of stuff out there on the market worth of closing wheels to adapt and to fit your system. That happened to be a Dawn. That's the whole rig put together. The nice thing there, it can lift its wings, fold up for easy transportation. And I'm not sure if this one can, but some of them can put pressure on the wings. So you've got equal pressure right through the toolbar. But simply an air seeder with a whole lot of pipes blowing seed down into your rows. So that would be an interseeder. Koen is also represented here. There's the seed unit and there's the distribution pipes heading out to the rows. They get down to the rows. These guys have decided to put the seed right at the back before the last gang instead of in front for aggressive incorporation. It all depends on the seed size and what type of cover crop you're wanting and how deep you want to seed it. There again, it's not so clear because of the black of the machine, but the pipe comes down and blows against a distribution plate that just simply distributes the seed into that roller and roll it into the ground. I like the Lemken one who's got a double roller, so you're sort of making sure of more seed soil contact at the back. It's a Hineker, same principle, just different design, double disc with the closing wheel at the back. Maybe a word of apologies. Some people might have expected to have a proper lecture on interseeding and the trends in the States. You can all look on the internet and see what you find, but generally, no-till is sort of 140 million acres, which about 10% is cover cropped. That's sort of information that I've picked up on my travels now. And like I said at the Farm Progress Show, very disappointing. These last 3-4 slides were taken at the Farm Progress Show. That's about the most conservation type of machinery I could find. The general trend that I'm finding there now is, including a guy that we met in Wisconsin, was a sort of a compact disc turbo till type of operation after harvest or later on in the season. That or one of these combination disc ripper units that's got a leveler at the back, and then a simple field cultivation before planting. That's sort of very simple. Bear in mind, they don't want to call it subsidies, but they are subsidized. There's conservation payments. It makes it pretty easy to farm. As he said, his break even is $4.20 for a bushel of corn, and it's below $3.50 now. And my question was, how do you sustain that? They all avoid the subject of what help they get. But he got around it by saying, oh no, he's got leftover corn in the bins from last year, so he's going to... That didn't answer my question. These low prices aren't sustainable. And the way the guys are supported there, incentives again, August, it makes them not really forced to go into a system where you have to improve. Contrary to Brazil, you see the small scale guy there with his single furrow behind a horse doing it, as small as a single furrow. So that was sort of disappointing there. Is a lot of this stuff is carried by incentives, but it is growing. Having been to both the show and the No-Till conference, it's lovely being in the No-Till conference like a pig wallowing in mud with the other fellow pigs. It's just lacquer because everybody's talking the same stuff. It's conservation, it's no-till, you're getting new ideas and you're going for it. So don't be afraid to be that oak out on a limb. Eagles don't flock. You get on a right thing, go for it. Fly like an eagle, don't be like a turkey scratching around in the poo. And then never give up. I'm not trying to punt myself here, but I like to think I'm quite passionate. That after the conference in January, took my wife on a 30th anniversary little boat cruise. But guess what I was up to? Thank you very much.
Any questions, gentlemen?